It's not just a question of how do we fund evidence-based programs to stop gun violence. Well, what does evidence-based funding look like, right, that actually will sustain impact? And what are we asking nonprofits to do on the front lines of gun violence from the people who are deciding where the money goes that may actually be causing unintended consequences that may contribute to the problem? So I think that if we think of advocacy just as gun reform legislation, right, very specific towards how people use weapons or buy weapons or accountable to that, I think we really miss an opportunity to see advocacy much more broadly that will have an even larger impact and maybe even a more immediate impact, considering the state right now of where gun reform advocacy is in this country.
So I'm here at UC3P because I really care about the public sector and what it can accomplish, even though I myself come from a fairly privileged background. And this is a question that we ask a lot of people, but as a white person who's involved in gun violence advocacy, which impacts predominantly or disproportionately Black and Brown communities, how do you bridge the gap between, very separate worlds? And how does your organization engage with local communities and activists on the ground in them?
Yeah, it's a great and complicated question, but I think it's a really simple answer, and that has to do, one, with authenticity, and the other one has to do with relationship. As I kind of mentioned before when I was talking about how Maggie started Strides for Peace, there's words I can put on the philosophy of how we engage with partners that are equity-focused and things like that, but it's actually really about experiential and relationships. So we don't go to a community or we don't have partners where we come in and say, this is what we want you to do. This is what we think you should do. This is what you need to do. We come in and say, what do you need us to do to help? That's how we start every conversation. And people over time recognize when you say those kinds of questions and mean them and are authentic about it. So, for instance, like one of the programs we're doing right now that I mentioned, I think, in the beginning, is working on how there's a gap of services right now for a lot of frontline workers and community workers who experience primary and secondary trauma, right? They don't get to go on retreats or boondoggles or conferences. They don't get free yogas and M&Ms, right, in their offices. They don't have an office. So we started by saying, is there a need for you to get some time away and to build your resilience and to deal with your trauma and to be part of a community that you can get support from? So all along the way, and we hosted this retreat, which was phenomenal. We flew over a group from Israel and hosted it in a Catholic seminary. So talk about diversity. We had about 10 different communities and 3 major religions. But all along the way, we are asking for their input and asking for what they need and working hard to advocate for them. So it's not about our agenda, it's about theirs. And right there, that really sort of ameliorates all those sort of other potential racial or different community kind of tensions.
Given your background in working with hospitals and in public health related areas, how do you work to connect research and academic thought on gun violence with the lived experiences of the people that work or are harmed by it every day?
Right. I mean, that's a really ginormous, big question, and one I'm really interested in and that Stride's really interested in. Certainly, research is critical, but across the social services, the question is, what is research informed and what is research based, right? So as we talked about earlier, right, there's all these multiple factors that get involved around gun violence. And so do I believe that there's one strategy that will, research has covered an empirical analysis about how to stop this? No, it's hugely complex, and there's so many different components and moving parts to this puzzle that I think the best we can do with research is inform. So for instance, like a public health approach, right, talks about protective and risk factors. Those are really pretty common sense risk factors, and they're really great frameworks from which to build a program or to think about a program. Right. But when you think about a lot of evidence that goes on programs, right, you take organizations that have high political social capital. They tend to be the highest capacity organizations. That's why they're competitive to be part of the research. They're then funded in a comprehensive manner that may not be replicable in the existing funding environment that most nonprofits work in. And so if you do this kind of research, right, and you say this program works, but you're not replicating the entire ecosystem of that program, that to me is about evidence-informed versus evidence-based. The other thing I have to say, and I talk a lot about this with our community partners, but also when I have an opportunity to sit around a table with funders, is about having a bi-directional communication about solving problems. If an organization, who's working on the front lines in a community, that community is going to have different challenges, different assets, right? All right. So you take a theory of change that's been research-based, and then you go and you apply that to a community. And how do you work to tweak it, to make it so that it actually is targeted at the existing community, but also that is mindful and respectful, not just of that community, but what kind of resources that community has to address the problem, because they're certainly not equal across the board. And that's where I think the proximity issue is really important. That gets a little bit to your question you asked me before, about coming in from an outside community and saying this is how you should do things. A lot of the great thinking labs that we have are wonderful, but until you get on the ground and really understand the unintended consequences of implementation and the ecosystem, they're really only an idea.
So, as a final question, is there something about gun violence, advocacy, or strides for peace that you think our listeners ought to know?
Oh my goodness. How long do I have? I think what it is we do the Race Against Gun Violence. Every year we're going to have our 7th annual. It's on June 4th downtown. Last year, 36% of the attendees were the wealthiest zip codes, 34 were the poorest. You don't see that a lot in the city. You don't see that a lot in this world. And in the words of Brian Stevenson, and he's the person who wrote Just Mercies, who started the lynching memorial and is going to win the Nobel Peace Prize one day if I have anything to do with it, says, to change the world, you got to get close to a problem to understand it. And you have to change the narrative. And you have to maybe feel uncomfortable at times. You can't just do it from a perch, and you have to keep hope. And for those who are interested in that, I think a great way to step out, just to step your toes in the water of it all, is to come to this race, because you'll see there many survivors who've lost children and loved ones to this issue. You will see people who live so far away from the issue but care and take the time to come. And they're not learning about the issue by reading a paper. And I'm sorry, you guys are a policy school, and those are really important, but it's also the experiential. And you come and you hear a soprano who sings a song that the CSO Civic Orchestra is performing, that was written by a mom who lost to gun violence. And then Vic Mensa sings We Can Be Free. And then you look around and you see kids and people from the communities that are being impacted by gun violence. And you see their joy and their beauty and their talent and their resilience. And all of a sudden, it's not a theoretical problem anymore. It's not just a political problem. It's a human problem. And back to that thing, we only fight for what we love for. It opens the doors to thinking about the problem in a different way. So, as our tagline for our race is connect, commit, contribute, change, be part of building peace. Change can happen in multiple ways. It's really important in the political sphere. It's also important on the human level. And that's part of what we create the platform to connect people and organizations together so that they can increase the impact to end gun violence.
Thank you so much.
Everybody's welcome.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Credits go to Arjun Motta for producing and engineering, Sidhant Wadhera for co-interviewing, and Caroline Kubzansky for co-interviewing and editing. Our assistant production managers are Arjun Motta, Olu Ogidan, Saumya Karun, and Sidhant Wadhera. Our finance director is Donovan Harvey. Our publisher is Yaning Wong. Our intro music is Knockout 2 by Datubi, and our outro music is Yes Yes Y'all by Matt Large. Our cover art was designed by Shirin Raban. If you want to hear more podcasts, check out our website, uc3p.org. And if you want to contact us, our email is the uc3p@gmail.com. Please remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and share the show with a friend. My name is David Raban, and stay tuned. We'll be back next week to talk about public health research on gun violence with Dr. Jeffrey Butts. Next time on UC3P.
You do that through social norms, education, and changing the context in which behavior is acceptable. And that's public health. And so if we can do that with guns and gun violence, we're on the path.